Hi, my Crime Whisper family. I know many of you are tuning in tonight to let this story accompany your sleep, and I'm honored to be a part of your nighttime routine. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching? From what time is it there right now? And of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue uncovering stories that matter now. Let's get straight into tonight's case. Story begins. Dr. Cyril Wecht, case minus 2006. In January 2006, a high-profile legal battle emerged from Pennsylvania, capturing national headlines and shaking the forensic science community. At the center of it all was Dr. Cyril H. Wecht, a renowned forensic pathologist and former Allegheny County coroner. Wecht wasn't just any public official. He was a giant in his field over decades. He had worked on some of the most high-profile forensic cases in the country, from the assassination of John F. Kennedy to the deaths of Elvis Presley and John Bonet. Ramsey Butt, that legacy came under threat when U.S. Attorney Mary Beth Buchanan announced an 84-count federal indictment against him. The charges ranged from fraud and theft to misuse of public office, accusing Dr. Wecht of exploiting county resources for personal and professional gain. The allegations were serious: using government vehicles for private travel, having county employees carry out tasks related to his lucrative private consulting business, like sending faxes, making copies, and handling mail, diverting public funds and assets to advance his own interests. What made the case even more explosive was the claim that Dr. Wecht had arranged for unclaimed bodies from the coroner's office to be transferred to the University of Pittsburgh's medical school, not purely for science, but allegedly in exchange for access to university facilities that benefited his private practice. The public was divided to some. It was a clear-cut case of a powerful man abusing his authority to others. It looked like a politically motivated takedown. Dr. Wecht's defense team was quick to argue that the charges were exaggerated and possibly retaliatory, pointed to his frequent criticism of the Bush administration and previous clashes with conservative officials, including Buchanan herself. A Bush appointee's attorneys insisted that many of the so-called violations were minor administrative issues. His private consulting work had always been transparent, and most importantly, no prior investigation had ever found fault with his operations. Still, the prosecution pressed on, claiming a pattern of systematic abuse of public resources. They painted a picture of a man who blurred the lines between public service and private profit, someone who built a million-dollar business on the back of taxpayer-funded support. Legal analysts and media outlets across the country followed the case closely. Some questioned whether the charges justified such a full-blown federal prosecution, especially given Dr. Wecht's stature and past contributions. Others argued that no one should be above accountability, no matter how prominent or accomplished. As the trial progressed, it became one of the most polarizing public corruption cases in Pennsylvania's history, not just because of the man at the center, but because of what it represented: the tension between ethics and power, the fragile line between public duty and personal ambition, and the question of whether justice itself can ever be truly free from politics. Whether you believe Dr. Wecht was guilty of unethical conduct or the victim of a politically driven vendetta, his case remains a powerful reminder of the complex world public officials navigate and the high price of crossing certain lines. Story continued. The trial of Dr. Cyril Wecht. As the trial of Dr. Cyril Wecht unfolded, many began to question whether the federal government's aggressive approach was truly justified. At its core, the case seemed to revolve more around administrative violations and serious criminal conduct, and yet the prosecution was treating it like a high-stakes corruption scandal. Former county employees were called to the stand. Some testified that they had, indeed, been asked to perform duties related to Dr. Wecht's private consulting business, all while on the county payroll. These tasks included making photocopies, arranging travel, and even helping to organize private case files. But the defense was ready. They countered with their own witnesses, individuals who argued that these duties were minor and that it wasn't unusual for public officials to engage in outside consulting work. What Dr. Wecht did, they claimed, was not criminal, but part of a common professional practice. Then came one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. The prosecution revealed emails and internal memos indicating that Dr. Wecht had previously been warned about potential conflicts of interest, but had ignored those warnings. This evidence was presented to show that his actions weren't careless oversights, they were deliberate decisions, made in full knowledge of the ethical lines he was crossing. The courtroom was becoming a stage for something far bigger than just one man's actions. Legal scholars, forensic experts, and political commentators weighed in this case had begun to symbolize the tension between public duty and private enterprise, especially for professionals like Dr. Wecht, who moved between both worlds. The stakes were high. If convicted, Dr. Wecht faced serious prison time, and the outcome could reshape how similar cases were handled in the future. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere grew tenser with each passing day. The prosecution insisted that no one, not even a man of Dr. Wecht's stature, should be allowed to misuse public office without consequence. The defense held firm, arguing that the government was overreaching, using the justice system to target someone they simply didn't like. As the trial approached its final stages, both sides prepared for closing arguments. The pressure was mounting. Closing arguments and deliberation. The prosecution was first. Their closing statement was sharp, decisive, and unwavering. They reiterated how Dr. Wecht had allegedly misused county employees, government vehicles, and even engaged in a controversial exchange of unclaimed bodies for access to university facilities. They reminded the jury that he had been explicitly warned, yet continued anyway. This isn't an honest mistake, the prosecutor said. This is about a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. He used public funds, public staff, and even human remains to boost his personal business. Then came the defense. Their tone was measured but passionate. They urged the jury to see through what they called a politically driven smear campaign. This isn't about criminal conduct, said the defense attorney. It's about power, and using that power to silence a man who spoke out against the government. If this prosecution stands, then any public official, anyone who's ever sent a fax or made a call during work hours could be next. The jury's struggle after weeks of arguments, evidence, and testimony. The jury finally began their deliberations. Legal analysts warned that this would not be an easy decision. Some jurors were reportedly convinced by the prosecution's documentation and email trail. Others found the political overtones of the case troubling and weren't convinced that the allegations rose to the level of criminality. Days passed. The jury asked to review documents, revisit key testimonies, and clarify legal instructions. It became clear they were deeply divided. In a dramatic twist, the jury returned with news. They were deadlocked despite lengthy deliberations. They could not reach a unanimous decision. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. The reaction inside the courtroom was instant. Some gasped, others sat in stunned silence. Neither side got what they wanted. The prosecution had failed to secure a conviction. The defense had failed to win full vindication. The case had ended in legal limbo. The aftermath and dismissal in the days that followed. Legal experts debated what would come next. Would the government retry the case? The answer came in 2008, when the new presidential administration under Barack Obama brought changes to the Department of Justice. Mary Beth Buchanan, the U.S. attorney who had pursued the case so vigorously, was no longer in charge. Without her leadership, the Justice Department made a final decision. They would not retry Dr. Wecht. Charges were officially dismissed. Dr. Cyril Wecht walked away from the courthouse, not acquitted, but not convicted either. His reputation had taken a hit, but his career wasn't over. He resumed his work in forensic pathology, continued lecturing, wrote books, and even returned to expert testimony in criminal cases. For some, he remained a symbol of the gray area between ethics and criminal law. For others, he was a target of a politically motivated prosecution, a man whose brilliance had made him enemies either way. The case of Dr. Cyril H. Wecht remains one of the most debated legal battles in the intersection of public service, science, and justice. Story 2 begins now. Let's move on to our second story of the night, one that spans continents, millions of dollars, and the darker side of high finance. These is the case of Su Shuang and Su Guojin, two former Bank of China executives, in one of the most elaborate international embezzlement schemes in modern history. The crime unfolds in January 2006. A federal grand jury in Las Vegas, Nevada indicted Su Shuang, Su Guojin and their wives on multiple charges, including racketeering, money laundering, and fraud. The charges stemmed from an investigation revealing that the two bank executives had masterminded a scheme to embezzle more than $485 million from the Bank of China, a staggering sum that would later be laundered through a maze of offshore accounts, shell companies, and even the casinos of Las Vegas. The complexity of the case immediately drew national and international attention. The operation spanned multiple countries, involved years of evasion, and highlighted the vulnerabilities of global financial systems when exploited by individuals in trusted positions. According to the indictment, Su and Su transferred the stolen funds through an intricate web of international accounts. One of their key laundering strategies involved Las Vegas casinos, where they purchased high-value gambling chips, played briefly or not at all, and then cashed out those chips to receive clean money in the form of casino-issued checks. This process allowed them to disguise the origins of the stolen money and integrate it seamlessly into the legitimate financial system. The scheme deepens. The two men didn't act alone. Their wives, Quang Wanfang and Yin Yi, were also deeply involved in managing and moving the funds across borders. They helped shuttle millions through Canadian and Caribbean banks, routing money into the United States, where it could be converted and spent without immediate detection. For years, Su and Su lived lavishly in the U.S. Under assumed identities. They resided in luxury homes, drove expensive cars, and enjoyed an extravagant lifestyle that far exceeded any legitimate income. Their scheme relied on the shadows, on the speed and complexity of international finance, and on the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. But eventually, someone did. How they were caught. It all began to unravel when Chinese banking regulators detected unusual discrepancies in accounts managed by the Bank of China's Guangdong branch, where both men had previously worked. In internal audit revealed gaping shortfalls in funds, and once Chinese authorities began tracing the missing money, the trail led overseas. Alarmed, the Chinese government reached out to U.S. law enforcement, prompting a coordinated transnational investigation. The U.S. Department of Justice, along with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Chinese law enforcement, launched an intensive operation that would take months to complete. Investigators uncovered evidence of dozens of offshore shell companies, financial transfers across multiple jurisdictions, wiretaps, surveillance, and luxury assets purchased under false names. Bit by bit, the pieces came together. In early 2006, federal authorities were able to identify and locate Su and Su, both hiding in plain sight in the U.S. The evidence was overwhelming, and soon after, a grand jury handed down indictments, charging the former bank executives and their spouses with a laundry list of federal crimes. The broader impact of the case was a wake-up call, not just about embezzlement, but about how fragile the global financial system can be when high-ranking insiders choose to exploit it. It highlighted the critical role of international cooperation in financial crime investigations, the ease with which large sums can be hidden behind the veil of casinos and offshore banking, and the need for stronger internal controls in financial institutions. Even those as large and powerful as the Bank of China legal experts saw this case as more than just a massive theft. It was a blueprint for how financial crime can go undetected for years, and a reminder that money, when laundered well, can move freely and quietly, escaping scrutiny without the right systems in place. Conclusion: the financial fugitive legacy. The indictment of Su Shuang and Su Guozhen remains one of the most striking examples of transnational financial crime in recent U.S. legal history. It forced a closer look at how financial institutions around the world handle transparency, compliance, and ethical oversight. And it served as a bold statement by the U.S. government. No matter where the money goes, justice will follow. Final words and wrap up. And that wraps up tonight's second story, from a respected forensic pathologist caught in the crossfire of politics. Two rogue bank executives orchestrating one of the largest embezzlement operations of our time. These cases show us that no one is too powerful, too distant, or too well connected to be brought into the light. If you're still listening, thank you for spending your evening with me. Let me know in the comments which story intrigued you more. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss another quiet but powerful crime story. This is Crime Whisper, signing off gently, so you can sleep soundly. Good night. Story 2 continued. The arrest and trial of Su Shuang and Su Guozhen. The federal indictment painted a striking portrait of an elaborate financial crime, charging Su Shuang and Su Guozhen with conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering, and fraud, according to prosecutors. The two former Bank of China executives had orchestrated a scheme that drained nearly $500 million from one of China's largest banks, then funneled those stolen funds through a maze of international channels, landing eventually in the casinos of Las Vegas. When U.S. law enforcement finally moved in to arrest the suspects, they encountered more than just paperwork. They faced resistance. Su Guozhen, tipped off about the impending arrest, attempted to escape through an emergency exit in a Las Vegas hotel, but undercover agents, already stationed nearby, intercepted him before he could flee. Meanwhile, his wife Yin Ye was found at their residence, allegedly destroying financial records, an act that further implicated her in the money laundering operations. Su Shuang, the second executive, was taken into custody without incident. His initial response: complete denial. He insisted the funds were legally acquired, and that the entire investigation was the result of a misunderstanding, or worse, a fabrication. But the authorities weren't buying it. The evidence and the web of deceit. Investigators had spent years quietly collecting an overwhelming body of evidence: bank statements, recorded phone conversations, surveillance footage, and testimony from financial experts. All of it pointed toward a meticulously executed plan to defraud the Bank of China and launder the proceeds through a complex series of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and casino transactions. The stolen funds had financed a lifestyle of extreme luxury, but they had also, investigators claimed, been used to bribe officials and co-conspirators, helping Su and Su evade detection for years. Some of the money had been wired to Hong Kong-based companies that didn't even exist in any operational sense. Others were funneled through dummy corporations used solely for laundering. Authorities even uncovered safe deposit boxes filled with large amounts of unreported cash, stashed away across various cities, further demonstrating just how far the pair had gone to hide their wealth. An international legal challenge. But prosecuting this case wouldn't be simple, because Su and Su had been arrested on American soil. Their prosecution had to follow the legal standards of the United States, despite heavy interest and pressure from the Chinese government, which saw the crime as a national embarrassment. Defense attorneys argued that the case was politically motivated, an attempt, they claimed, to scapegoat their clients amid rising tensions between China and the U.S. But federal prosecutors remained confident. The evidence, they believed, spoke for itself. The trial begins when the trial finally began. The prosecution laid out its case in precise detail. They traced the flow of money from the Bank of China through international transfers and ultimately into Las Vegas casinos, where it was laundered and reintroduced into the financial shipping charts. Wire transfer logs and surveillance videos told a compelling story. One of the most damning pieces of evidence: footage from Las Vegas casinos showing Su and Su exchanging massive amounts of cash for gambling chips, sitting at baccarat tables for only minutes, then cashing out as if they'd won big. This tactic, known as minimal play, is a well-known method used in money laundering by appearing to gamble, then quickly cashing out. The criminals could receive casino-issued checks, making it seem like the money had been legally earned. Expert testimony and the breaking point. Financial experts took the stand to help the jury unravel the intricate web of transactions. Bank auditors detailed the irregularities that first raised red flags in China. Forensic accountants traced the flow of funds through offshore entities in Canada, Hong Kong, and the Caribbean, and law enforcement officials described their multi-agency effort to locate and build a case against the suspects. Then came a pivotal moment. An unexpected witness, a former accomplice, testified against Sue, and Sue, in exchange for a reduced sentence. They shared detailed accounts of how the laundering scheme worked, how the money was moved, how dummy corporations were set up, and how Sue gave orders to avoid detection. This testimony aligned with the prosecution's entire case and seriously undermined the defense's claim of political persecution. The verdict and aftermath. As the trial came to a close, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. They emphasized the scale of the fraud, the sophistication of the laundering techniques, and the brazen arrogance of the defendants, who had lived in luxury in the U.S., convinced that were beyond the law's reach. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for leniency, claiming their clients had been mischaracterized, and that the political climate had unfairly influenced the case. Then came the verdict after several days of deliberation. The jury returned with their decision. Guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. The sentencing phase followed. Quickly, prosecutors pushed for lengthy prison terms. Citing the severity and international scope of the crimes, the defense argued for a lighter sentence, pointing to their clients' cooperation and the geopolitical complexities of the case. Closing reflections. The case of Su Shuang and Su Guojin was more than just a story of embezzlement. It was a stark reminder of how financial systems can be manipulated, how international borders can be crossed with a keystroke, and how even the most sophisticated criminals eventually face justice. And for law enforcement, it was a rare win in the battle against global financial corruption, made possible by patience, international cooperation, and a refusal to let nearly $500 million disappear without consequence. Story 3. The tragic death of Cindy Neo. Singapore, 2006. In January 2006, the quiet order of Singapore was shaken by a case so tragic, so heartbreaking, that it left an entire nation grieving and questioning the systems meant to protect its most vulnerable. This is the story of 4-year-old Cindy Neo, a little girl whose life was stolen in an act that stunned both the public and the justice system. It began on the afternoon of October 7, 2004. In the Telok Blangah housing estate, Cindy was at home when she was taken by 37-year-old Constance Chi Chung Hin, a former Singapore Airlines stewardess. Constance had once been in a romantic relationship with Cindy's father, Neo Eng Tong, but by the time of the incident, their relationship had long ended, and Neo had moved on, dedicating himself to raising Cindy. What happened next would horrify the country. After abducting Cindy, Constance brought the child to her apartment at Boon Shong Road. There, in a moment of psychological unraveling, she threw Cindy from the high-rise apartment window. The fall caused catastrophic injuries. Cindy was rushed to the hospital with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. She fought for her life for 5 agonizing days, but tragically, she succumbed to her injuries. Singaporeans were devastated. News of Cindy's death made national headlines, not only because of her age, but because of the complex web of emotional entanglements and mental health issues surrounding the case. At first, Constance Chi was charged with both abduction and murder, but as the investigation progressed, deeper layers began to emerge. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Constance had been suffering from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that distorts one's perception of reality, often causing hallucinations, delusions, and emotional Instability experts testified that she had been experiencing persistent symptoms of paranoia and delusion. Leading up to the crime, her mental condition, they said, had significantly impaired her judgment at the time of the incident. Because of these findings, the murder charge was eventually reduced to culpable homicide, not amounting to murder, a legal recognition that while her actions led to Cindy's death, they were influenced by diminished mental responsibility. This was no easy decision for the courts in a country known for its firm stance on crime, especially crimes involving children. The case sparked intense public debate. Some felt that justice had been softened. Others believed compassion and mental health awareness had finally found a place in the courtroom. In April 7, 2006, Constance Chi was sentenced to 13 years in prison, 10 years for culpable homicide, and 3 years for abduction. The judge emphasized the tragedy of the case, while acknowledging her condition and the need for both punishment and rehabilitation. Sentence wasn't just about retribution, it carried a message that people suffering from severe mental illness must receive treatment, not just judgment. The legal system needed to evolve to recognize the complexities of mental health, especially in cases where reality itself becomes fractured. As more details emerged, the public learned of Constance's personal struggles. Once a poised, intelligent flight stewardess, she had gradually spiraled after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Her illness cost her career, relationships, and eventually her grip on reality. Her relationship with Cindy's father had already ended, but Constance was unable to let go. Her fixation on him, and tragically, on Cindy, escalated to a breaking point. The defense argued that Cindy's death was not a calculated murder, but the devastating result of untreated mental illness. The prosecution, while acknowledging her schizophrenia, maintained that she was still aware enough of her actions to bear responsibility in the end. The court was forced to walk a tightrope, weighing the gravity of a child's death against the tragedy of a woman consumed by her own mind. This case prompted national reflection. Mental health advocates called for better psychiatric support. Legal scholars debated the evolving role of mental illness in criminal law, and families across Singapore held their children just a little closer, wondering how such heartbreak could be prevented. Cindy Neo's story is more than just a legal case. It's a painful reminder of the consequences of untreated mental illness, the fragility of human emotion, and the importance of early intervention. Her death left a scar on the national conscience, but also sparked important conversations about mental health, justice, and compassion in modern society. Story 3. Part to the legal reckoning in the case of Cindy Neo. As the trial of Constance Chi unfolded, so did a deeply divided public conversation, one that would ripple across Singapore's legal and mental health systems for years to come. Many were adamant she had taken the life of a defenseless 4-year-old child. For them, nothing less than the harshest punishment would suffice. But others saw a more complex truth. They argued that Constance was as much a victim as she was a perpetrator, a woman in the grip of untreated schizophrenia, crying out for help in a society that had not heard her. These clashing perspectives created a national reckoning. As the legal proceedings continued, the court was forced to wrestle with an agonizing question: to what extent should mental illness mitigate criminal responsibility? Psychiatrists testified that Chi's actions had been shaped by the distortions of a deeply fractured mind, yet she retained enough awareness to be held accountable, at least in part. And so, the court made its decision. The original charge of murder was downgraded to culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Reflecting what the judge called her diminished responsibility, she was also found guilty of abduction, an offense that compounded the gravity of her actions. On April 7, 2006, Constance Chi was sentenced to a total of 13 years in prison, 10 years for culpable homicide, and 3 years for kidnapping Cindy. The sentence sent shockwaves through Singapore. To some, it felt like an unbearable leniency. The idea that someone could abduct and kill a child and walk free after just over a decade felt like a betrayal of justice. Parents were particularly haunted. They struggled to reconcile the ruling. With their own sense of safety, many couldn't accept that mental illness could excuse, or even explain, the violent death of a little girl, but mental health advocates and legal reformers saw the case differently. They viewed the verdict not as soft, but as an overdue recognition that mental illness plays a profound role in criminal behavior, and that justice isn't always black and white. They pointed to schizophrenia, a disorder that can shatter perception, blur the lines between fantasy and reality, and strip someone of control in their view. The true failure was not the crime, but the system that let her slip through the cracks without care or treatment. The trial may have ended, but the national discussion was only just beginning. Could this tragedy had been prevented if Constance Chi had received proper psychiatric support earlier? Why wasn't there an intervention before her condition deteriorated into violence? And how should Singapore treat offenders who aren't fully in control of their actions? These were the haunting, unanswered questions that hovered long after the verdict was read. Her sentence also raised serious concerns about how Singapore handled mentally ill offenders rather than being committed to a psychiatric facility. Constance Chi was sent to prison. This led to renewed debate. Would she receive appropriate psychiatric care while incarcerated? Was prison the right environment for someone with severe mental illness? Could she pose a danger to herself or others behind bars? These concerns ignited calls for specialized facilities, institutions that could treat and rehabilitate mentally ill offenders, while still upholding justice. In the years that followed, Chi's case became a staple in Singaporean law schools. Professors used it to teach students about the legal gray areas of diminished responsibility and the ethical tension between retribution and rehabilitation. Defense lawyers began to push harder for psychiatric assessments. Judges became more attuned to mental health factors in violent crimes. Even mental health organizations took notice. They launched campaigns aimed at increasing public awareness of schizophrenia, its warning signs, its treatment options, and the importance of early diagnosis. These efforts were not just about preventing future tragedies. They were about breaking the stigma that often kept people from seeking help in the first place. But for Cindy's family, none of this was consolation. Her father, Neo Ang Tong, was devastated. The guilt of ever having been involved with Constance was a weight he could never shake. He had lost his daughter, and with her, the very foundation of his life. Birthdays became unbearable. Photographs ached with silence. Every passing year was a cruel reminder of what was stolen. For all the legal analysis and public discourse, one truth remained painfully clear. Cindy Neo was gonna end. No sentence, no courtroom, no psychiatrist, no reform could bring her back. Story 3, ending Constance Chi and Cindy Neo. The sound of children laughing in playgrounds, the sight of little girls in school uniforms, even the scent of Cindy's favorite foods for Constance Chi. These everyday moments became unbearable reminders, haunting echoes of the life she had stolen. Prison, for her, wasn't just a sentence, it was a space of reckoning. She had lost everything: her freedom, her career, and the version of life she once knew. Though declared mentally ill at the time of the crime, she still experienced moments of clarity, moments in which she had to confront the unimaginable weight of her actions. Her punishment extended far beyond confinement. It was a journey of facing the irreversible damage she had caused. But one question remained unanswered. Did she truly understand the magnitude of her crime? And more unsettling, could someone who had caused such profound pain ever truly reintegrate into society? In the end, the case of Constance Chi and little Cindy Neo became more than just a tragic courtroom drama. It became a national mirror, reflecting Singapore's evolving understanding of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the limits of justice itself. It forced the country to ask painful questions. How do we hold someone accountable when their mind is fractured? How do we protect the public while acknowledging the realities of psychiatric disorders? The case also exposed cracks in Singapore's mental health system and underscored the urgency of reform long after the trial faded from headlines. Its impact echoed in policy debates, social awareness, and the quiet grief of a family left forever changed Singapore, often praised for its strict laws and low crime rate, was reminded that some crimes defy simple categories, right and wrong, guilt and innocence, justice and mercy sometimes. As this case revealed, the truth exists in a painful shade of gray story for Japan's corporate scandal, the fall of Lividor. In January 2006, Japan was shaken by a corporate scandal that would forever change the nation's approach to financial regulation and corporate ethics. At the center of the storm was Lividor, an internet services conglomerate led by the charismatic and controversial CEO Takafumi Hori, known nationwide simply as Horiman. Young, brash, and wildly ambitious, Hori symbolized a new generation of Japanese entrepreneurs, rebels willing to challenge the country's rigid corporate culture. But his rise came to a crashing halt on January 16th, when Tokyo prosecutors raided Lividor's offices, Hori's home, and the residences of several company executives. The charges: securities fraud, accounting violations, and deliberately misleading the market. Authorities believed Lividor had manipulated financial statements to inflate earnings and had issued false press releases to boost stock prices, even claiming acquisitions that had never occurred. The market reaction was instant and devastating. Between January 17th and 18th, panic set in. Investors, stunned by the scandal, triggered an unprecedented sell-off. The Tokyo Stock Exchange (TSE), overwhelmed by the trading volume, was forced to halt operations early, a move never before seen in its history. Then, the scandal took a tragic turn on January 18th. Hideaki Noguchi, an executive at HS Securities, a firm closely tied to Lividor, was found dead in a hotel room in Okinawa. Authorities ruled it a suicide. The news sent further shockwaves across Japan, and just days later, on January 23rd, Hori and 3 other Lividor executives were arrested. For many, Hori's fall was more than personal. It was symbolic. He had been hailed as a disruptor, a maverick who represented hope for a modernized, globally competitive Japan. But now, the man once celebrated for innovation was accused of deception. What once seemed like ambition now looked like greed. What once passed for brilliance now appeared as manipulation. Media narratives quickly shifted. Hori, who famously wore casual clothes instead of suits and clashed with Japan's conservative business elite, became a scapegoat, portrayed as the face of corporate excess. But Hori fought back in court. He denied all wrongdoing, claiming that his practices were common among other firms and that he was being singled out for challenging the establishment. His defense argued that Japan's old guard executives were punishing him for breaking the mold. Still, the evidence was damning. Prosecutors presented internal documents, emails, testimony from former employees, all pointing to a coordinated effort to manipulate Lividor's financial image through a network of shell companies and misleading public statements. The public backlash was fierce. Retail investors, many of whom had believed in Hori's vision, saw their savings wiped out. Regulators faced harsh criticism. How had a company this big, this visible, gone unchecked for so long? Why hadn't the Financial Services Agency intervened earlier? In response, Japan's financial authorities scrambled to restore public trust. New regulations were introduced. Market transparency was strengthened. Corporate ethics became a hot-button topic in boardrooms across the country. Lividor's scandal had become more than just a case of fraud. It was a national reckoning. It forced Japan to confront the risks of unregulated innovation, the blind spots in its corporate governance, and the need to modernize its regulatory systems without losing sight of ethical foundations. In the years that followed, the legacy of Lividor lived on in reforms, in textbooks, and in the cautious eyes of investors. Takumi, Hori's story became a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked, of power unaccountable, and of the fragile balance between breaking barriers and respecting boundaries. Story 4. the fall of Takafumi Hori, and the Lividor scandal. In the heart of Tokyo's bustling financial district, a scandal was unfolding, one that would forever change Japan's corporate landscape. At the center of it was Takafumi Hori, often known simply as Horiman, a young, bold entrepreneur who had captivated Japan with his vision for a modern, aggressive approach to business. As CEO of Lividor, he promised innovation, disruption, and a break from Japan's old-school corporate traditions. But behind that glossy promise was a tangled web of deception. As the investigation deepened, evidence began to suggest that fraudulent activity had taken root inside Lividor. Witnesses described a corporate culture where deception was not just tolerated, it was encouraged. Profits were prioritized above all else. Those who questioned shady practices pushed aside. As the trial gained momentum, it became clear Hori wasn't going to escape accountability. Japan's legal system is known for its exceptionally high conviction rates, especially when it comes to financial crimes. Prosecutors insisted that letting him walk free would set a dangerous precedent, a signal to other corporations that white-collar crime could go unpunished. They pushed hard for a strong sentence, one that would serve as a warning to any executive tempted to take similar shortcuts. But for many, the case wasn't just about one man. It represented a crossroads in Japan's economy, a clash between tradition and innovation. Was Japan ready to embrace a more aggressive, Western-style business model, or would its deep-rooted corporate customs continue to reign? Some still viewed Hori as a rebel, a visionary who dared to challenge the establishment and paid the price for it. They admitted he may have made mistakes, but believed his mission to shake Japan's stagnant economy had merit. As the trial neared its conclusion, public interest hit a fever pitch. News outlets ran constant coverage. The courtroom was packed with reporters, analysts, and everyday citizens, all waiting to see how justice would be served. The prosecution had built a damning case. They presented evidence of manipulated stock prices, misleading press releases, and a maze of shell companies used to fabricate revenue streams. The impact had been massive. Investors had suffered huge losses. Trust in the market was shaken, and Japan's financial world was reeling. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Hori refused to admit guilt. His defense claimed Lividor had simply used accounting strategies common in Western firms. Not fraud, they argued. He was being punished not for criminal acts, but for refusing to play by Japan's unwritten rules. But the tide had turned. The public, once fascinated by Hori's audacity, now saw him as the symbol of unchecked greed. In March 2007, the verdict came. Hori was found guilty of securities fraud and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. It was less than what the prosecution had sought, but still a historic judgment. Other Lividor executives also received sentences, though some were suspended. The message was clear. Even Japan's most high-profile figures would face real consequences for corporate crimes. The fallout was swift. Lividor was delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Its assets were sold off. Employees lost their jobs. Investors lost their savings. The name, Lividor, once a symbol of innovation, became synonymous with scandal and betrayal. As for Hori, his fall from grace was brutal. Once a media darling, he became a disgraced figure. He appealed, but his conviction was upheld in 2011. He entered prison. The lavish lifestyle, the talk show appearances, the corporate glory, gone on. Yet, even behind bars, Hori remained a polarizing figure. Some still admired him, not for what he did, but for what he tried to change. They pointed to other corporate scandals where leaders escaped with barely a slap on the wrist. Perhaps, they argued, he was made an example, not because of his crimes, but because of who he dared to challenge after his release. Hori didn't disappear. He wrote books, gave interviews, launched new ventures. He couldn't erase the stain of the Lividor scandal, but he refused to retreat from the spotlight. To some, he was still an advocate for reform. To others, a cautionary tale of hubris. Today, the Lividor scandal is remembered as a turning point. It led to stricter regulations, deeper scrutiny of public companies, and a cultural shift in how corporate fraud is handled in Japan, but perhaps more than anything, it became a symbol of the tension between ambition and accountability, innovation and ethics, progress and tradition. Story 5. The HIV transmission. Case of Andre Chad Perenzi, Australia, 2006. In January 2006, Australia was shaken by a criminal case that tested the boundaries between public health, personal responsibility, and criminal law. The man at the center was Andre Chad Perenzi, a 35-year-old chef living in Adelaide, South Australia. What made this case so controversial wasn't just the crime itself, but the disturbing questions it raised about how societies manage the threat of infectious disease. Perenzi had been diagnosed as HIV positive in 1998 at the time. He was fully informed of the risks associated with the virus and the legal responsibility to disclose his condition to any sexual partner, but despite that knowledge, over the next several years, he engaged in unprotected sex with multiple women, never disclosing his status. It wasn't until one of his partners tested positive for HIV and later confronted him that the truth began to unravel. Investigations revealed a disturbing pattern. Perenzi had willfully exposed women to a life-altering virus. Repeatedly, and without remorse, authorities charged him with endangering life. A serious offense in Australian law. The case sparked national debate. How should the legal system treat individuals who knowingly spread communicable diseases? Where should the line be drawn between personal privacy and public safety? During the trial, prosecutors painted Perenzi as someone who knowingly and selfishly put others at risk. Witnesses, including former partners, testified to the betrayal, the shock, and the trauma of discovering they had been exposed without consent. Perenzi's defense tried to argue that he didn't fully understand the transmission risks, but medical experts were clear. He had been informed multiple times, both verbally and in writing. The court didn't buy his excuses. In 2006, Andre Chad Perenzi was found guilty on 3 counts of endangering life. He became the first person in South Australia to be convicted under such charges for HIV transmission. The case stirred powerful emotions across the country. Many saw it as justice, a clear message that intentional exposure to life-threatening diseases would not be tolerated. Others worried about the broader implications. Would criminalizing HIV transmission discourage people from getting tested or seeking treatment? Whatever your view, the Perenzi case became a landmark moment, not just for public health law, but for how we define accountability in the age of communicable disease. The Andre Chad Perenzi case, the case that would come to define the intersection of public health and criminal accountability, began with the stories of 3 women known, in court documents only, as Miss KC, MSMC, and Miss JB. Miss KC had been in a long-term relationship with Andre Chad Perenzi, beginning in the early 1990s. The couple had 2 children together. What she didn't know was that during the course of their relationship, Perenzi had contracted HIV, and he never told her. After their separation in 2000, Perenzi entered a new relationship with MSMC, just like before. He engaged in unprotected sex without ever disclosing his HIV positive status. In 2001, MSMC tested positive for HIV, a diagnosis that would change the course of her life forever. Then came Miss JB. She had a brief relationship with Perenzi in 2004. It wasn't Perenzi who told her about his condition, it was one of his previous partners. Fortunately, JB tested negative, but the psychological impact of learning she had been exposed to HIV without her knowledge was devastating. In January 2006, the Supreme Court of South Australia began proceedings against Perenzi. He faced 3 counts of endangering life, charges that reflected the gravity of what he had done. The prosecution's argument was straightforward, yet chilling. Perenzi had knowingly concealed his HIV status. He had unprotected sex with multiple women, and he did so with full awareness of the potential consequences. They emphasized that he had not only tested positive, but had also received explicit medical counseling on the risks and responsibilities associated with living with HIV. Yet he chose deception over disclosure. But The defense took a controversial and deeply disturbing approach rather than claiming ignorance or misunderstanding. Perrins's lawyers challenged the very scientific foundation of the charges. They brought in witnesses from the Perth Group, a fringe faction of AIDS denialists who claimed HIV had never been conclusively proven to exist. There was no definitive link between HIV and AIDS, and that transmission through sexual contact was unproven to the public health community and scientific experts. This was not just a defense, it was dangerous misinformation globally. Decades of research had already confirmed HIV is a real virus. It is the cause of AIDS, and it can absolutely be transmitted through unprotected sex. As the trial gained media attention, health professionals voiced serious concern. This was more than just a court case. It was a potential setback to public health education. If Perrins's defense succeeded, it could legitimize pseudoscience, sow doubt, and discourage testing or treatment. The court, however, was not swayed. Expert witnesses, including virologists and doctors, were called by the prosecution to debunk the defense's claims. They presented evidence on how HIV is isolated, how it affects the immune system, and how it is transmitted. Then came the victims' testimonies. MSMC was one of the most powerful voices in the courtroom, fighting back tears. She recounted how she had trusted Perrins completely, never suspecting he was hiding a life-altering truth. After her diagnosis, her world unraveled. The betrayal, the fear, the stigma each became part of her daily life. She described the lifelong medical care, the social isolation, and the emotional trauma she now carried. Miss JB also testified, though she had not contracted the virus. She spoke of the psychological damage, the fear of waiting for test results, the anger at the violation of her trust, the crushing realization that someone she had been intimate with had recklessly endangered her life. In contrast, the defense's witnesses appeared out of step with medical reality. Their claims were refuted by every major health organization worldwide, and their presence in court was seen as both offensive and irresponsible. In January 2006, Andre Chad Perrins was found guilty on all 3 counts. The verdict was more than just a legal outcome. It was a public declaration that personal responsibility matters, that knowingly putting others at risk has consequences, and that science, not denials, should guide our understanding of public health crisis. The case had lasting impact in Australia and beyond. It became a reference point in legal discussions about the criminalization of disease transmission, the ethics of disclosure, and the importance of consent and communication in intimate relationships. It also reignited debates on how misinformation, especially when presented under the guise of expert testimony, can harm not only individuals, but entire communities. In the years that followed, public health campaigns in Australia ramped up. They focused on reducing stigma, encouraging regular HIV testing, promoting safe sex, and fostering openness between partners. Legal scholars began examining the fine line between protecting public safety and preserving personal rights. But most importantly, the Perrins case served as a stark reminder that one person's reckless secrecy can cause lifelong harm to others, and that in matters of health, truth and transparency can save lives. Andre Chad Perrins case, criminal HIV transmission trial. Epidemiologists took the stand calmly, but firmly dismantling every claim made by the defense. They brought with them decades of peer-reviewed research, countless medical studies, and crystal-clear evidence confirming not only the existence of HIV, but its direct, proven link to AIDS. The jury was shown electron microscope images of the virus, detailed medical reports, and listened to testimony from scientists who had dedicated their entire careers to studying and fighting the epidemic. The prosecution warned the court of the dangerous precedent the defense was trying to set by promoting misinformation. They weren't just trying to exonerate Andre Chad Perrins, they were threatening public health on a national level. If the defense's falsehoods were believed, people might stop getting tested, avoid life-saving treatments, or even take needless risks based on the illusion that HIV was not a serious threat, while the court allowed the defense's witnesses to speak. It quickly became clear their arguments were built on pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. Their testimony was ultimately dismissed, unreliable, misleading, and Dangaru's parents himself remained largely silent throughout the trial. When he did speak, he showed no real remorse. He didn't apologize to his victims, didn't acknowledge the pain he had caused. Instead, he cast himself as a victim, blaming the medical system rather than taking responsibility for his deliberate actions. The trial progressed. The evidence against him piled up. His HIV-positive diagnosis proof he'd received extensive education on preventing transmission. His decision to ignore it, all he had lied to his partners, exposed them to a life-changing virus, all without their knowledge or consent. Public reaction was swift, and visceral news outlets across Australia covered every turn in the courtroom. The outrage was intense, too many knowingly exposing others to HIV was as serious as any other violent crime. There were even calls to strengthen existing laws to ensure that such reckless endangerment would never go unpunished again. As the trial neared its conclusion, legal experts began debating broader questions. Should someone who knowingly spreads a deadly disease be charged with attempted murder? Do our current laws go far enough? And how should public health and criminal justice work together to prevent these tragedies? The prosecution rested its case, confident they had proven beyond reasonable doubt that Andre Chad Perens was guilty. Verdict and sentencing. The jury deliberated for hours, combing through every detail, the medical records, the victim statements, the sheer recklessness of it all. The defense's last-ditch effort to discredit decades of science had failed miserably. The prosecution's case was airtight. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The judge asked for the verdict. 4 persons stood guilty on all counts. A collective hush settled over the room, then a slow ripple of emotional release. Some victims sighed in relief, others wept quietly for years. They had waited for justice now. It had arrived, but the trial wasn't over yet. Next came sentencing. The prosecution argued that Perens's behavior was not just reckless, it was cold, calculated, and callous. They described how his victims, especially Ms. SMC, would now face a lifetime of antiretroviral medication, stigma, and emotional trauma. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency. They painted Perens as a man who had struggled, a man whose silence came from fear, not malice. They spoke of his troubled past, his supposed ignorance, and his need for redemption. But in the face of the damage he had caused, their words felt hollow. For issuing the sentence, the judge addressed Perens directly. Mr. Perens, this court finds your actions to be of the utmost recklessness. You were given knowledge that placed the lives of others in your hands rather than act with responsibility. You chose deception and selfishness. The people who trusted you are now living with irreversible consequences, and this court will send a clear message. Such disregard for human life will not be tolerated. The sentence, 15 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 9 years. It was one of the harshest penalties ever handed down in Australia for knowingly transmitting HIV, and it set a legal precedent. Aftermath and legacy. The verdict sent shockwaves through both legal and public health communities. Advocacy groups hailed it as a victory for victims' rights. Others, however, raised concerns about the potential dangers of criminalizing health conditions. Some legal experts argued that education, accessible treatment, and public health reform might be more effective than punitive measures alone. And then there was the stigma. While the case had rightly held Perens accountable, many feared it might further entrench the shame and fear surrounding HIV, the same fear that prevents many from seeking testing or disclosing their status. Health organizations urged society to distinguish between intentional harm and those struggling silently due to discrimination, trauma, or systemic barriers. The debate between public safety and compassion remained an urgent and unresolved question. Perens attempted multiple appeals in the years that followed. All rejected. The courts stood firm. The evidence was overwhelming, and the threat he posed undeniable. Meanwhile, survivors tried to move forwards. SMC, in particular, turned her pain into purpose. Becoming a vocal advocate for HIV awareness, she partnered with support groups, spoke publicly about her experience, and dedicated herself to educating others on prevention, testing, and safe disclosure. The case of Andre Chad Perens became a landmark in Australian legal history. It was cited in future cases involving the criminal transmission of communicable diseases, and it forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about ethics, justice, and public health. Behind bars, Perens faded into obscurity. The man who had once tried to evade accountability was now serving his sentence in silence. But outside the prison walls, the echoes of his case endured in law books, courtrooms, classrooms, and the lives of those he hurt. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. The Richmond spree killings, a city shattered. The wave of terror began on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2006, inside their South Richmond home. The Harvey family, Brian, his wife Catherine, and their two young daughters, Stella and Ruby, were brutally murdered. Brian was a well-known local musician, and Catherine owned a beloved toy store in the neighborhood. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the community. The crime scene was horrifying. The entire family had been bound, gagged, and their throats savagely slashed. The house was then set on fire in what appeared to be an attempt to destroy evidence. Investigators were left reeling. The violence was both calculated and deeply personal. Yet the Harveys were known to have no enemies. Just 5 days later, on January 6th, another grisly discovery was made in Richmond's South Side in a ransacked home. The bodies of 21-year-old Ashley Baskerville, her mother Mary Tucker, and her stepfather Percival Tucker were found. They had been similarly bound and suffocated. The chilling similarities between the two crime scenes led police to a devastating realization: the same killers were responsible. Urgent multi-agency investigation was launched as tips poured in from the public. Two names quickly rose to the surface: Ricky Javon Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge, cousins with a violent history in both. Recently released from prison, their movements around Richmond placed them at the scenes of the murders on January 7, 2006. Gray and Dandridge were arrested in Philadelphia. What they confessed to next stunned authorities. They admitted to both sets of killings, stating that their original motive was robbery, but the level of brutality used suggested something far more sinister. In the case of the Harveys, Gray and Dandridge had entered the home under the false pretense of asking for directions. Once inside, they subdued the family, looted their home, and then murdered them in cold blood. Gray's confessions revealed an even broader pattern of violence. His killing spree hadn't started in Richmond, but in Pennsylvania, on November 5, 2005. Just 2 months earlier, Gray had murdered his own wife, Treva Gray, high on PCP. He beat her to death with a metal pipe because she had, in his words, been annoying him. His emotionless recollection of the act chilled investigators. It became clear that Gray had descended into a state of total disregard for human life. After killing Treva, Gray teamed up with Dandridge, and together they traveled state to state, committing robberies and escalating acts of violence. By the time they arrived in Richmond, they were ready to kill without hesitation. According to Gray's confession, the Harvey family became their next target simply because their garage door was open. They assumed it would be a straightforward robbery. They entered under the guise of asking for directions, but once inside, something shifted. Gray decided there would be no witnesses. The family was bound and gagged after ransacking the house for valuables. Gray methodically executed each member of the family. He first slit the throats of Brian and Catherine. Then, without mercy, he turned to 9-year-old Stella and 4-year-old Ruby and did the same to cover their tracks. The men set the house on fire before fleeing when neighbors noticed smoke and called emergency services. First responders were met with a devastating scene. The fire had not completely destroyed the bodies, leaving behind clear evidence of a calculated and brutal murder, not a tragic accident. The Richmond community was in disbelief. The Harveys had been a symbol of love, music, and Joy Bryan's musical legacy had touched many, and Catherine's toy store was a beacon of happiness for children. Their loss felt deeply personal to all who knew them, but the nightmare wasn't over on January 6th, just 5 days after the Harvey murders. Gray and Dandridge killed again this time. The victims were Mary Tucker, Percival Tucker, and their daughter Ashley Baskerville. Like the Harvey family, the killers knew their victims. Ashley Baskerville had been dating Dandridge and had allegedly acted as a lookout during the Harvey murders, but for reasons still unclear, perhaps fear of betrayal or a desire to leave no loose ends, Gray and Dandridge turned on her and her family. All three were bound, suffocated, and killed inside their home. The spree was over almost as quickly as it had begun in 2006. Ricky Gray was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Ray Dandridge received life without parole. Their sentences reflected the unimaginable horror they had inflicted and the deep scars they left on Richmond's soul. The killings prompted hard questions. How had two recently released felons been able to commit such devastation so quickly? Could the system have done more to prevent this? Could Trevor Gray's life taken weeks earlier have been the warning that saved others? In the years that followed, the Richmond spree killings became a symbol of senseless violence, and systemic failure memorials were held. Bryan's music continued to be celebrated. Catherine's toy store, rebuilt and reopened, became a space of remembrance, but for many, the pain has never faded. The legacy of Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge is one of destruction, but the legacy of their victims, Bryan, Catherine, Stella, Ruby, Mary, Percival, and Ashley, is one of love, light, and a community that came together in the face of evil. Their stories remain etched into the heart of Richmond, forever a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that sometimes hides behind ordinary doors. The Richmond spree killings, a week of unimaginable horror. Ashley Baskerville had once stood by Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge during their earlier crimes, but loyalty meant little to the two men. Authorities believe her murder may have been premeditated, a brutal effort to silence a potential loose end. On January 6, 2006, Gray and Dandridge entered the home of Percival and Mary Tucker, Ashley's parents, just as they had done days earlier with the Harvey family. The intruders quickly overpowered everyone inside. Each member of the Tucker household was bound and gagged before the home was looted. Percival and Mary were suffocated with plastic bags placed over their heads. Ashley was strangled with a belt. The methodical nature of the killings shocked investigators. It was as if Gray and Dandridge had developed a routine, a process of execution they carried out with chilling efficiency and without hesitation. Their quick escalation from one massacre to the next suggested they had no intention of stopping. Had they not been caught, authorities feared the spree might have continued indefinitely. When news of the second family slaughter broke, panic swept through Richmond. Two families murdered in under a week without clear motive. Without warning, the randomness of the violence deepened the public's fear. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure to catch the perpetrators before more lives were lost. Detectives worked relentlessly, connecting the dots between the two scenes. The similarities: home invasion, binding, suffocation, arson led them to conclude that both killings were the work of the same individuals. The breakthrough came when a tip placed Gray and Dandridge in the Richmond area around the time of the murders. Surveillance footage from a nearby store confirmed their presence. Once their identities were revealed and their criminal backgrounds reviewed, the picture became clear. These were two recently released ex-convicts with violent pasts, and they had just committed two of the most brutal crimes in Virginia's history. Police tracked the pair to Philadelphia, where they were arrested on January 7, 2006. The confessions came swiftly. Ricky Gray, disturbingly calm and detached, spoke openly about what he had done. He described the murders in detail, showing no remorse. He spoke of killing the Harvey children as if it had been a necessary chore, offering no emotion, no regret. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile in Virginia's history. Prosecutors depicted Gray and Dandridge, as cold-blooded killers who took innocent lives not out of desperation, but for control, gratification, and cruelty. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA at the crime scenes, the suspect's own confessions, and the testimony of investigators who had been haunted by what they'd witnessed. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening to every gruesome detail: how their loved ones had been restrained, how they had fought for breath, how they had died in 2006. Ricky Gray was sentenced to death for the Harvey family murders. Ray Dandridge, while equally culpable in the eyes of many, was not considered the principal instigator. He received life in prison, without the possibility of parole but for Richmond. Legal justice could not erase the horror of that week. The tragedy wasn't just in the number of lives lost. It was in the sheer senselessness of it all. These were not gang-related killings. They weren't crimes of passion. These were deliberate, calculated executions of entire families who had done nothing to provoke such violence. They had simply been at home. Brian Harvey had been a well-known musician, a beloved part of Richmond's cultural fabric. His music had brought joy to many. Catherine Harvey, owner of a local toy store, had created a haven for neighborhood children and families. Their daughters, 9-year-old Stella and 4-year-old Ruby, had their whole lives ahead of them in a single act of incomprehensible evil. Their futures were stolen. Purcell and Mary Tucker were known as hardworking and loving, and Ashley Baskerville, though caught up in dangerous company, had still been a daughter, a friend, a human being. Her murder by those she trusted added yet another layer of heartbreak to an already devastating story. As the trials continued, Richmond sought healing, but closure proved elusive. The brutality of the crimes, the lack of motive, and the emotional scars left behind made recovery nearly impossible. Gray's confessions alone would have been enough to convict him, but the forensic evidence only deepened the horror. Gray never expressed remorse. He never offered a true explanation. The question lingered: why? Why these families? Why this level of cruelty? There were no answers, only silence, only horror. In the years that followed, the city tried to honor the victims in every way it could. Catherine's toy store remained open, continuing her mission of joy and wonder for children. Brian's music lived on through tribute concerts and memorials. Community events were held in remembrance of the lives taken, especially those of the 2 young girls, whose absence was felt most profoundly. The murders attracted national attention, not just because of their brutality, but because they raised urgent questions about the criminal justice system, about parole, rehabilitation, and public safety. Both Gray and Dandridge had been released from prison not long before the killings. Could they have been stopped? Gray remained on death row for more than a decade, his execution delayed by a series of appeals. Some opposed the death penalty altogether. Others, especially the victims' families, believed it was the only appropriate punishment. January 18, 2017. Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. His final words were short. He offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed for some. His execution brought a measure of closure for others. It did little to soften the blow. No sentence, no punishment could ever undo what had been done. The Richmond spree killings remain one of the darkest chapters in Virginia's criminal history. The brutality, the randomness, the utter disregard for human life, and the haunting loss of 2 innocent families whose only mistake was being home when evil came knocking. Their memory lives on, and so does the reminder. Even in the most peaceful communities, darkness can hide in plain sight. Story 7. The murder of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle, a family destroyed in January 2006. A tragedy unfolded in the quiet town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, one that would captivate national attention and leave an entire community mourning. On January 20th, the bodies of 27-year-old Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian, were discovered inside their home. Both had been shot, Rachel in the head, Lillian in the abdomen. A .22 caliber handgun was found beside Rachel's body, initially leading police to suspect a murder-suicide bet. Almost immediately, those closest to Rachel rejected the theory. She was a devoted mother who adored her daughter, and the idea that she would harm Lillian was unthinkable as investigators dug deeper. A far darker and more disturbing truth began to emerge. Rachel's husband, Neil Entwistle, was nowhere to be found when the bodies were discovered. He had reportedly returned to his native England shortly after the murders. His sudden disappearance raised serious suspicions. The picture that began to form was one of deception and despair. Neil, who had presented himself as a successful computer consultant, was in fact unemployed and drowning in debt. His financial situation was dire, and he had kept the extent of his troubles hidden from those around him. Detectives soon learned that Neil had purchased a one-way ticket to England on January 21st. Just one day after the killings, he made no effort to contact authorities, report the deaths, or even notify Rachel's family. Instead, he quietly fled, seeking refuge with his parents in Worksop, Nottinghamshire. This evasive behavior only intensified suspicion. Further investigation uncovered Neil's secret life. He had been frequenting escort websites and engaging in sexually explicit online conversations with various women. Behavior that stood in stark contrast to his image as a devoted husband and father. It soon became clear Neil had been living a double life. Forensic evidence only strengthened the case against him. Gunshot residue was found on his clothing, and his fingerprints were identified on the weapon used in the murders. Ballistics confirmed that the firearm had come from a collection owned by Rachel's stepfather, Joseph Matarazzo, who kept his guns locked away in their Carver, Massachusetts home. Neil had accessed, and the motive digital evidence proved damning. Computer records showed that in the days leading up to the murders, Neil had conducted multiple internet searches on topics like how to kill someone, how to commit suicide, and how to shoot effectively. These searches were traced directly to his personal laptop. Faced with overwhelming evidence, authorities issued an international arrest warrant. Neil Entwistle was taken into custody by British police on February 9, 2006, and extradited to the United States to stand trial for the murders of his wife and child. Trial began in June 2008. Prosecutors argued that Neil had killed Rachel and Lillian to escape his mounting personal failures and financial collapse. The narrative was both tragic and chilling. Rather than face humiliation or responsibility, Neil chose to eliminate the family he claimed to love. Neil, for his part, maintained his innocence. He claimed he had returned home to find Rachel and Lillian already dead, and that fear and panic had driven him to flee the country. But the jury saw through the lie after less than 2 days of deliberation. Neil Entwistle was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigation continued. Law enforcement meticulously pieced together the timeline. Rachel and Lillian had last been seen alive on the morning of January 20th, just 10 days after the Entwistles had moved into their new home, seemingly ready to begin a new chapter. But behind closed doors, desperation was festering on the morning of the murders. Rachel had woken up and begun tending to Lillian. It was then that Neil acted. He retrieved the .22 caliber pistol stolen from his in-laws' locked cabinet and entered the bedroom. Rachel was lying in bed when Neil shot her at close range, killing her instantly with a single bullet to the head. Lillian, just 9 months old, was still in her mother's arms when she was shot in the abdomen. After the murders, Neil methodically tried to cover his tracks. He wrapped the bodies in blankets and turned up the thermostat, likely in an attempt to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. He powered off his phone and left the house. Surveillance cameras would later show him at Logan International Airport, purchasing that one-way ticket to London. Neil's abrupt exit from the country sent shockwaves through Rachel's family and law enforcement. When Rachel's stepfather was asked to check his firearm collection, he discovered that one of his guns, the same .22 caliber used in the killings, was missing. He had never given Neil access or permission to take it. Forensic tests sealed the case. Neil's fingerprints on the gun, gunshot residue on his clothes, search history filled with plans for murder. There was no longer any doubt. This case stunned a nation, not only because of its brutality, but because of its betrayal. Neil Entwistle had robbed his wife and daughter of their lives, and then attempted to rewrite the narrative, as if he were the victim. He wanted to escape not just his circumstances, but his responsibilities, by any means necessary, even after justice was served. The pain of Rachel and Lillian's deaths continued to ripple through the community. Friends, family, and strangers alike were left grappling with the senselessness of it all. How a husband and father could commit such an unfathomable act. The Entwistle case remains a haunting reminder of how darkness can exist behind a polished people can carry devastating secrets, and how desperation, if unchecked, can lead to unimaginable tragedy. Rachel and Lillian's names live on in their memory. We are reminded to pay closer attention to the warning signs, to reach out when something feels off, and to never underestimate the importance of vigilance in preventing the unthinkable. The murder of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle, the family man who lied confusion, quickly turned to suspicion. When Neil Entwistle disappeared without explanation, authorities had attempted to reach him, but he was unresponsive. He had made no effort to report his wife and daughter missing, nor had he checked on their welfare. Instead, he quietly boarded a flight and returned to Worksop, Nottinghamshire, seeking refuge with his parents, while Neil attempted to vanish into the background in England. Alarm was growing back in Massachusetts. Rachel's mother, Priscilla Matarazzo, had been calling her daughter repeatedly, each call going unanswered, with a rising sense of dread. She contacted the Hopkinton Police Department and requested a welfare check. On January 22, 2006, 2 officers were dispatched to the Entwistle residence from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The house was locked. There were no signs of a break-in or visible struggle, but once inside, the silence was unsettling. As the officers moved through the house, they eventually entered the master bedroom, and there, under a blanket, they made a horrifying discovery. Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian, were lying motionless on the bed. At first glance, the scene appeared strangely serene. No blood, no mess, but as officers drew closer, the truth became undeniable. Both mother and child had been shot. Rachel had been shot in the head, Lillian in the stomach. The discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Hopkinton, a town known for its small-town charm, and close-knit families had suddenly become the setting of a deeply disturbing crime. Investigators immediately turned their attention to the one person missing from the picture. Neil Entwistle had become the prime suspect, not only because of his abrupt disappearance, but because of mounting evidence. U.S. authorities worked quickly with their British counterparts to locate Neil, and on February 9, 2006, just under 3 weeks after the murders, he was arrested in London. At the time of his arrest, Neil was composed, even emotionless. There were no signs of grief or confusion. He didn't ask what had happened to his wife and child. His indifference alarmed investigators. Most would expect a grieving father and husband to be distraught or desperate to help. Instead, Neil was cold, calculating, questioning. Neil offered an alternative version of events. He claimed he had gone out to run errands on the morning of January 20th and returned home to find Rachel and Lillian already dead. Terrified and overwhelmed, he said, he panicked and fled the country. But his story immediately rang hollow. If Neil truly found his wife and child murdered, why didn't he call 911? Why didn't he alert Rachel's family? Why flee unless he had something to hide? As the investigation progressed, more damning evidence came to light. Neil's financial situation was dire. He had maxed out credit cards and had no stable job. Despite portraying himself to Rachel's family as a successful entrepreneur, behind the image was a man drowning in debt. Desperate to maintain appearances, his internet history painted an even darker picture. Neil had been visiting escort websites and exchanging explicit messages with other women, while still pretending to be the perfect husband. The dual life he was leading, combined with his financial instability, suggested a man on the brink. Prosecutors would later argue that Neil viewed Rachel and Lillian not as loved ones, but as obstacles. With them out of the way, he could start fresh, shed his responsibilities, and live the life he believed he deserved in the end. His fantasy led to the brutal murder of his wife and child, Neil. His so-called escape plan only hastened his downfall as he awaited extradition back to the U.S. Authorities continued to compile evidence. His fingerprints were found on the .22 caliber murder weapon, which belonged to Rachel's stepfather. Gunshot residue was discovered on his clothing, flight records confirmed. He had purchased a one-way ticket to England just a day after the murders. Without informing a soul, the extradition process was swift, and by mid-February 2006, Neil Entwistle was back in Massachusetts. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, his trial would become one of the most publicized in the state's history. When the trial began in June 2008, the courtroom was filled with reporters, legal experts, and Rachel's grieving family. The nation watched as the case unfolded. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Neil Entwistle was, they said, a manipulative man living a double life. They introduced forensic evidence, gunshot residue on Neil's clothing, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, and his chilling internet searches in the days leading up to the crime searches for how to kill someone and how to commit suicide. The murder weapon, they proved, came from Rachel's stepfather's locked gun cabinets, suggesting Neil had both motive and opportunity. Ballistics confirmed the match. Prosecutors also exposed Neil's financial lies. While he'd claimed to be running a lucrative business, he was, in truth, unemployed, broke, and living on borrowed time. They argued that Rachel and Lillian represented the life he no longer wanted, the life that was keeping him from the fantasy he hoped to create. One of the most damning blows to Neil's defense came from the timeline. He said he'd returned to find Rachel and Lillian dead, but phone records and flight logs didn't support that claim. Instead of calling police, Neil went online, bought a ticket, and left the country without telling anyone what had happened. When police finally tracked him down in England, they expected confusion, fear, heartbreak, anything but the cold detachment he displayed. His defense team tried to present an alternative story. They claimed Neil had acted out of shock, not guilt, that he had found his family murdered and fled in fear. But the evidence told a different story, one of premeditation, cowardice, and betrayal. In the end, the jury took less than 2 days to reach their decision. Neil Entwistle was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Entwistle case shattered the illusion of the perfect family and exposed the danger that can hide behind a smile. It left a small town grieving, a family broken, and a nation haunted by the unthinkable. A man murdering his wife and infant daughter, not in a fit of rage, but in cold, calculated pursuit of a fantasy life. Rachel and Lillian's lives were cut tragically short, but their memory endures as a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes the real danger isn't a stranger breaking in from the outside, it's the person sleeping in the same bed. Neil Entwistle trial continued. The defense attempted to divert blame, suggesting that Rachel, possibly suffering from postpartum depression, had killed baby Lillian before turning the gun on herself. They questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence, claiming gunshot residue could have been transferred to Neil's clothing in other ways, but their arguments were weak and quickly dismantled by the prosecution. Rachel had no documented history of depression, let alone suicidal tendencies. Friends and family described her as a devoted, joyful mother who adored her daughter. They dismissed the defense's theory as not only implausible, but deeply offensive. Medical examiners further debunked the narrative. The positioning of the bodies, the trajectory of the gunshots, and the absence of defensive wounds all indicated that Rachel had been murdered while she slept. Had she taken her own life, the weapon would have been found much closer to her body, but instead, it had been carefully placed aside, suggesting an attempt to stage the scene. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Neil became overwhelming. The prosecution presented testimony from former colleagues and acquaintances who described him as a compulsive liar obsessed with portraying himself as wealthy and successful as online activity, frequenting escort services, and engaging in explicit chats. Paint a picture of a man detached from the reality of his responsibilities. Rachel's family sat through every painful moment of the trial. Her mother, Priscilla Matt, was visibly emotional as crime scene photos were shown and Neil's emotionless police interviews were played for the jury. The pain of losing both her daughter and granddaughter was immeasurable, but she remained determined to see justice served after weeks of testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On June 25, 2008, they returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. Massachusetts law mandates life in prison without the possibility of parole for such convictions. As the judge handed down the sentence, he addressed Neil directly, calling the murders a cold and calculated act of betrayal. Neil remained emotionless, offering no visible reaction. Outside the courthouse, Priscilla spoke to reporters. "We miss them every single day," she said, "but at least we know the man who took them from us will never walk free again." In the years that followed, Neil Entwistle filed several appeals, of which were rejected. The courts found no merit in his claims of unfair trial procedures or mishandled evidence. He remains incarcerated in a Massachusetts correctional facility, serving a life sentence. The Entwistle case left a permanent scar on the quiet town of Hopkinton. It served as a haunting reminder that even those who appear to have perfect lives can harbor dark and dangerous secrets, and sometimes the greatest threat comes from the person closest to your actual. And Lillian were never forgotten there. Family continues to honor their memory, remembering Rachel's warmth and Lillian's innocent smile. Their tragic story stands as a sobering lesson about deception, selfishness, and the devastating toll of unchecked desperation. Story 8. United States vs. Karen Fletcher. In February 2006, a landmark legal case unfolded in the U.S. that pushed the boundaries of internet freedom and redefined the debate over obscenity and written content. Karen Fletcher, a 56-year-old woman from Donora, Pennsylvania, was indicted on 6 counts of distributing obscene materials online. Her case: United States vs. Karen Fletcher quickly became a lightning rod in First Amendment circles. Fletcher operated a website called Red Rose Stories, a subscription-based platform where she published fictional narratives involving the molestation, torture, and murder of children. Access to the site cost $10 per month, and at the time of her indictment, it had 29 paying subscribers. And like most obscenity cases, which center around visual content, Fletcher's case was unique in that it focused solely on written text. U.S. Attorney Mary Beth Buchanan, who brought the charges, asserted that Fletcher's stories clearly violated federal obscenity laws. Obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment, Buchanan stated, and this content is as patently offensive as anything possibly could be. Attorneys countered that her disturbing writings were a form of expression, not intended to be pornographic, but rather therapeutic. They drew comparisons to violent and controversial works of fiction, such as A Clockwork Orange, and even episodes of South Park. They also noted that Fletcher did not widely distribute her stories. Access was restricted to paying members only. Defense placed particular emphasis on Fletcher's mental health. She had been sexually abused as a child and suffered from agoraphobia, crippling fear of public spaces. They argued her stories were a form of catharsis, helping her cope with the trauma she endured throughout her life. In a sworn affidavit, Fletcher wrote, "I've always been afraid of monsters. The monsters in my life were real, and they always had unlimited access to me and my stories. I created new monsters once. I could control the case," drew intense attention from First Amendment activists, who argued that prosecuting someone purely for written content set a dangerous precedent. Would this open the door to broader censorship of disturbing fiction? Where was the line between free speech and criminality? As legal proceedings continued, Fletcher's fragile health and psychological state became central concerns. Her attorneys claimed she would not survive a prolonged trial due to her mental condition and physical ailments, facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. Karen Fletcher eventually agreed to a plea bargain in May 2008. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of distributing obscene materials under the terms of the agreement. She received 5 years of probation, including 6 months of home detention though. she avoided prison time. The case left a lasting impact. It became a pivotal moment in the debate over internet regulation, obscenity laws, and the protections or limits of the First Amendment. Karen Fletcher's writings never surfaced again, but her case remains a cautionary tale in the ever-shifting landscape of digital speech and legal responsibility. The Karen Fletcher case, a battle between obscenity law and free speech. Karen Fletcher's case remains one of the most controversial and complex obscenity prosecutions in U.S. history. Unlike traditional cases centered around explicit images or videos, the case was entirely based on written fiction, dark, graphic stories involving the abuse and murder of children. Published on her subscription-based website, Red Rose Stories in February 2006, the 56-year-old woman from Donora, Pennsylvania, was indicted on 6 counts of distributing obscene materials online. The case, United States v. Karen Fletcher, quickly drew national attention, not only for the disturbing content, but for what it represented in the larger debate over internet regulation and First Amendment protections. Prosecutors argued that Fletcher's work met all 3 prongs of the Miller test, the legal standard established by the Supreme Court in Miller v. California, 1973. To define obscenity, the material appealed to prurient interests. It depicted sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, and it lacked serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. They claimed that Fletcher's stories served no legitimate purpose, instead pandering to deviant fantasies and crossing the line into the obscene. They also emphasized that Fletcher actively distributed the material to paying subscribers, 29 in total at the time of indictment, transforming her work into a commercial enterprise rather than a private form of expressing. Fletcher's defense team pushed back hard. They argued that no actual images, victims, or physical acts were involved, just words. Historically, obscenity prosecutions had focused on visual media, not written text. Fletcher's lawyers warned that if fiction alone could be criminalized, then no controversial book or disturbing creative work would be safe. They cited examples like Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, which also contained graphic depictions of criminal behavior but remained protected literary works. Moreover, Fletcher's attorneys presented compelling evidence about her mental health. She had been sexually abused as a child and suffered from severe agoraphobia, PTSD, and anxiety disorders, conditions that had kept her confined to her home for years. Writing, they argued, was not just an outlet for her trauma, but her only connection to the outside world. In a written affidavit, Fletcher said, "I have always been afraid of monsters. The monsters in my life were real, always there, with unlimited access to me. In my stories, I created new monsters, ones I could control still." The prosecution maintained that her work was more than just therapeutic. They claimed the website contributed to a dangerous subculture and pointed out that some subscribers had criminal records involving child exploitation. Even if Fletcher hadn't intended harm, they argued, her writings could encourage real-world offenses. The defense refuted that claim, insisting that her stories, however disturbing, were purely fictional and never linked to actual crimes. They cautioned that prosecuting someone solely for their written words would set a dangerous precedent for censorship, especially in a world where provocative content was increasingly published and consumed online. The case sparked concern among free speech advocates organizations, like the ACLU and Electronic Frontier Foundation, warned that prosecuting Fletcher could open the floodgates for broader censorship of literature, art, or satire, especially if such content was deemed offensive by public standards. Commentators pointed out that similarly grotesque themes appeared in popular media, from The Silence of the Lambs to the Saw franchise. Why, they asked, was Fletcher being targeted? Many believed it was because her stories involved children, subjects so emotionally charged that it often clouded rational debate even within law enforcement. Opinions were divided. Some agents saw Fletcher as enabling dangerous fantasies, Others viewed her as a deeply traumatized woman who needed mental health support more than incarceration after all. She had never physically harmed anyone, nor had she engaged in any illegal conduct beyond publishing her fictional stories. As the trial approached, Fletcher's deteriorating health and fragile mental state became central concerns. Her attorneys argued that she was unfit to endure a lengthy legal battle ultimately. In May 2008, Fletcher agreed to a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to one count of distributing obscene material and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, including 6 months of home detention. She was also required to forfeit her computer. The resolution left many questions unanswered because the case never went to trial. It set no legal precedent still. It reignited debates around the regulation of online content and the boundaries of First Amendment protections, particularly as user-generated platforms and digital communities continued to expand. The Karen Fletcher case stands as a stark example of the legal and moral tensions surrounding free expression in the internet age. It challenged society to consider how to protect vulnerable populations from harmful content without suppressing the right to speak, right, and process trauma. No matter how dark the medium may be, facing a possible 30-year sentence in federal prison, Karen Fletcher was trapped between two grim choices: take her chances at trial and risk a devastating conviction, or accept a plea deal that would mark her as a criminal for life. Her attorneys, aware of the emotional toll and legal risks, continued negotiating behind closed doors, hoping to secure a deal that would spare her from incarceration. Meanwhile, the case sparked a nationwide debate. Editorials in prominent newspapers clashed. Some warned the government was overreaching into constitutionally protected territory, while others condemned Fletcher's work as so vile it fell far outside the bounds of free speech. What began as a case about fiction had become a referendum on the limits of internet freedom, obscenity law, and the future of digital expression. The trial date loomed. The stakes escalated, not just for Fletcher, but for First Amendment rights across the nation. Prosecutors were confident. They warned that if she chose to go to trial, the jury, likely repulsed by the nature of her work, would not hesitate to convict. A guilty verdict could reshape how obscenity laws were interpreted in the digital age. Fletcher's legal team debated a bold defense strategy: fight for a victory if they could convince the court that her fictional writings were protected under the First Amendment. It could safeguard future creators from similar prosecutions, but the risks were enormous. A conviction would not only crush Fletcher, it could legally redefine certain types of written fiction as criminal obscenity. For Fletcher, the mounting pressure was overwhelming. Years of reclusion had left her physically and emotionally fragile. Now she found herself at the center of a national firestorm, scrutinized by legal experts, dissected by media commentators, and vilified by the public. Some painted her as a depraved woman, exploiting loopholes to profit off sick fantasies. Others saw a traumatized individual clinging to the written word as a means of psychological survival. A pivotal moment came when Fletcher's defense team brought in a forensic linguist. The expert argued that, despite their grotesque content, her stories bore hallmarks of trauma processing, more confessional than exploitative. The prosecution disagreed, dismissing the analysis and insisting that the stories lacked any artistic merit. They argued the material existed solely to cater to prurient interests, and that charging a subscription fee proved Fletcher was running a commercial enterprise. One of the key elements for an obscenity conviction under federal law. What intensified public outrage was the revelation that some of Fletcher's paying subscribers had prior convictions for child exploitation. This connection, though indirect, cast a long shadow over the case. Prosecutors contended that her website created a digital community that validated dangerous fantasies, even if she never committed or encouraged real-world crimes. Her work, according to the government, contributed to an ecosystem of harm. Fletcher's attorneys knew this fact would devastate their chances at trial. No matter how they framed the case as one of free speech, it was unlikely a jury would sympathize with a woman writing graphic fictional stories involving children, especially in an era of heightened awareness about child exploitation. The moral panic was simply too strong, and then, with trial looming and Fletcher's health deteriorating, a deal was reached in exchange for pleading guilty to 6 counts of distributing obscene materials. Fletcher would avoid prison. She would serve several years of house arrest, receive mandatory psychiatric treatment, and be placed on the sex offender registry. It was, for Fletcher, a heartbreaking compromise, but the alternative was worse, appearing frail and defeated in court. Fletcher formally entered her guilty plea, the judge acknowledging both her deteriorating condition and the troubling nature of her writings. Approved the plea agreement, but he emphasized that federal law granted the government full authority to prosecute obscene material. Even if it was fictional, the resolution sent shockwaves through the legal and literary worlds. Free speech advocates sounded the alarm for decades. Obscenity prosecutions had focused on visual media, films, photos, videos. Fletcher's case marked a stark departure, a criminal conviction based solely on written text. First Amendment lawyers feared the implications would horror writers, underground fiction authors, or even satirical artists be next. And yet, public reaction was largely muted or supportive of the outcome. The content of Fletcher's stories was simply too disturbing for many to rally behind her. Even those who supported free speech admitted that some boundaries might be necessary, particularly when content risked feeding dangerous desires. After the case, Fletcher disappeared from public life, confined under house arrest. Her website was permanently taken offline. The FBI issued clear warnings. They would continue monitoring digital spaces for similar content. The chilling message was unmistakable: fiction was no longer immune. The questions left behind by the case still linger. Where is the line between fiction and criminality? Should deeply disturbing but entirely imaginary stories be subject to legal punishment? And in a world where the internet allows anyone to publish anything, how should society balance free speech with public safety? Years later, legal scholars still cite United States v. Karen Fletcher as a landmark case, either as a necessary evolution of law in the digital age, or as a troubling example of government overreach. What's clear is that the internet has rewritten the rules of expression, and sometimes, when fiction crosses certain lines, the law may follow close behind. The case of Joseph Thomas, Jihad Jack, and the clash between liberty and national security. Fletcher became an infamous yet obscure figure, remembered not for who she was, but for the difficult questions her case forced society to confront. Story N. The rise and fallout of Jihad Jack. In February 2006, a groundbreaking legal case unfolded in Australia that would test the boundaries of the nation's newly enacted counter-terrorism laws. At the center of it all was Joseph Terrence Thomas, a 32-year-old man from Melbourne who became the first person convicted under Australia's post-9/11's anti-terrorism legislation, known in the media by the sensational nickname Jihad Jack. Thomas's case ignited fierce debates across the country about civil liberties, admissibility of foreign obtained evidence, and how far a nation should go in the name of national security. Thomas's journey into the legal spotlight began in 2001 when he traveled to Pakistan, claiming it was to study Islam. But during his time abroad, he attended a military training camp in Afghanistan, one allegedly linked to Al-Qaeda. Thomas would later insist that his intentions were purely religious and that he had no idea of the camp's true affiliations, but Australian authorities saw it differently. They accused Thomas of forming deeper ties with terrorist networks and alleged that he had received $3,500 from a senior Al-Qaeda operative, along with possessing a forged passport. Actions they believed were part of a plan to support terrorist operations. Undetected, Thomas returned to Australia in 2003 and was arrested soon after. His prosecution became a national spectacle, not only because of the terrorism-related charges, but because of how the key evidence against him was obtained: confessions given to Pakistani intelligence under questionable circumstances. The first trial. Confessions under fire. The trial began In early 2006, the prosecution's case leaned heavily on those confessions Thomas had allegedly made while in the custody of Pakistan's notorious intelligence service. He had, they claimed, admitted to receiving money from Al-Qaeda and acknowledged having a falsified passport for covert travel. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had knowingly aligned himself with extremists and who intended to use those funds for undisclosed, potentially dangerous purposes. The confessions, they argued, were valid and freely given. But Thomas's defense team challenged the core of the case. They argued that the confessions were made under duress, in an environment where psychological coercion was a daily reality. Thomas had spent months in secret Pakistani detention centers, often in solitary confinement, and was allegedly interrogated without legal representation. The defense insisted these circumstances violated his rights and rendered any statements made completely inadmissible in an Australian court. Still, the jury found Thomas guilty on 2 charges: receiving funds from a terrorist organization and possessing a falsified passport. He was acquitted of the more serious charge of intentionally providing resources to a terrorist group. The conviction was hailed by some as a landmark moment, a demonstration that Australia's anti-terrorism laws could work. Thomas was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 2 years. But the legal saga was far from over. The appeal, a fight for fairness, sat in prison. His lawyers were building an appeal centered on one critical argument: that the confessions, the backbone of the prosecution's case, were obtained in violation of fundamental legal principles. In August 2006, the Victorian Court of Appeal overturned the conviction, agreeing that the confessions had been made under circumstances that were incompatible with fairness and due process. The court ruled that the statements should never have been admitted as evidence. Thomas was released on bail, pending a retrial. His case had become a flashpoint in Australia, raising urgent questions about how justice should be pursued in a post-9/11's world. Public opinion and media frenzies. The media had already branded Thomas with a name that would haunt him: Jihad Jack. To some, he was a dangerous man who had consorted with terrorists. To others, he was a naive traveler, caught in the crossfire of global counterterrorism politics. His wife, whom he had met during his time in Pakistan, spoke emotionally to the press. She described how their family had been ostracized, how their children had to bear the weight of a surname now associated with extremism, and how the entire ordeal had broken them in ways the courts would never understand. Meanwhile, the government stood by the anti-terrorism legislation that had led to his conviction for them. Thomas's case was proof that Australia could respond decisively to emerging threats, but critics argued that his prosecution demonstrated just how fragile civil liberties could become under the weight of national fear, a dangerous precedent. Legal scholars and civil rights activists warned that if confessions extracted under foreign detention without proper oversight, transparency, or legal protections could be used in court, a dangerous precedent was being set. If the government could build a case on statements made in a foreign country under questionable conditions, what safeguards remained for Australian citizens abroad, and what would prevent future abuse of these extraordinary legal powers? The courtroom during Thomas's appeal was filled with journalists, rights advocates, and legal experts. Testimonies from international law specialists painted a troubling picture of Pakistani intelligence operations, alleging long periods of isolation, absence of counsel, and coercive interrogation methods. A legacy still debated, though the appellate court invalidated his conviction. Thomas's legal troubles didn't end. He would later face control orders, surveillance, and additional legal proceedings, all under the shadow of national security concerns. To this day, Joseph Thomas remains one of the most controversial figures in Australian legal history. He was never convicted of planning or carrying out a terrorist attack, yet he was publicly branded, repeatedly prosecuted, and monitored for years, a living symbol of the tension between liberty and security. His case challenged Australia to consider what justice means in an era shaped by fear of terrorism, and how far a democratic society should go in the name of protection Was Thomas a misguided man who made reckless choices, or a victim of overreach in the war on terror? The answer, for many, still lies in a gray area. But one thing is clear: the Jihad Jack case will be studied, debated, and remembered for years to come. Jihad Jack, life after acquittal, a legacy of suspicion. Although Joseph Thomas never reported physical torture while detained in Pakistan, his legal team argued that the psychological pressure he endured was more than enough to compromise the validity of any statements he made. They pointed to the constant threat of indefinite detention, held in a foreign country with no access to legal counsel or recourse, an environment they claimed was inherently coercive. In August 2006, the Victorian Court of Appeal agreed. The judges ruled that the confessions Thomas gave while in Pakistani custody should never have been admitted into evidence in the first place. The conditions under which those statements were obtained, the court concluded, rendered them inadmissible under Australian law. As a result, his convictions were overturned, and Thomas was released from prison. The decision sparked an immediate political backlash. Conservative lawmakers and law enforcement officials condemned the ruling, warning that it set a dangerous precedent, one that could hinder future efforts to prosecute individuals suspected of terrorism. They feared the ruling had created a loophole, allowing potentially dangerous individuals to evade justice simply because their confessions had been gathered overseas. But on the other side of the debate, civil rights advocates hailed the outcome as a critical victory for due process and the rule of law. It was, in their view, a reaffirmation that Australian courts could not accept confessions made under duress, no matter how serious the accusations. Legal scholars pointed to the Thomas case as a glaring example of the flaws in Australia's post-9/11 counter-terrorism laws they believed had been rushed through Parliament amid global security panic, with insufficient safeguards for individual rights. Despite his release, Thomas's ordeal was far from over control orders and civil liberties. Not long after walking free, Thomas found himself subject to a control order, a controversial legal mechanism introduced under Australia's anti-terrorism laws. This order imposed strict conditions on his daily life. He was required to observe a curfew, report regularly to authorities, and was banned from contacting certain individuals, many of whom were never publicly identified. He was also restricted from using specific communication devices and could not leave designated areas without prior approval. Government justified these measures by arguing that Thomas remained a security risk. Intelligence agencies maintained that he had trained with accepted money from terrorist operatives, and was still capable of engaging in activities that could threaten national security, even if none of these claims could be legally proven in court anymore. To Thomas, the control order felt like a sentence. Without a verdict, though he had been acquitted, his life was still being governed by suspicion. He struggled to reintegrate into society. Finding work proved nearly impossible, as potential employers recoiled from the stigma of his name. Jihad Jack, a nickname that had followed him relentlessly in the media. Even old friends and acquaintances began to keep their distance, wary of drawing the attention of law enforcement. Simply by association, his wife, who had stood by him throughout the legal battles, faced harassment from neighbors, while their children endured whispers and isolation at school. Going legal battles, Thomas sought to challenge the control order, arguing through his lawyers that it amounted to a form of ongoing punishment without trial. They argued that with his conviction overturned and no new charges filed, the restrictions were both excessive and unjust. Civil liberties groups joined the outcry, warning that the use of control orders represented a dangerous erosion of due process, a way for governments to impose life-altering restrictions on individuals without having to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet the courts sided with the government. Judges ruled that the control order was legally justified, stating that intelligence agencies had provided enough classified material to warrant continued restrictions. The decision reaffirmed the broad powers granted to authorities under Australia's counter-terrorism framework and underscored how even an overturned conviction, might not be enough to escape the reach of national security policy. Life in the shadows. In the years that followed, Joseph Thomas withdrew from public life. He moved to regional Victoria, hoping that distance and anonymity might offer some relief from the intense scrutiny. But the shadow of his past was never far behind Evan. In quiet communities, the stigma lingered. Locals who recognized his face or his name remained cautious, and Thomas's efforts to rebuild a life of normalcy met repeated obstacles. Despite the legal system ultimately ruling in his favor, he remained known as Australia's first convicted terrorista. Labeled that no appeal could fully erase his case, continued to echo through legal and political circles. It became a reference point in debates over the admissibility of foreign confessions, the reach of national security laws, and the balance between civil liberties and public safety. Legal experts cited his experience as a warning about the dangers of relying on evidence extracted in foreign detention centers, where basic rights are often suspended. Meanwhile, security officials stood by the original charges, maintaining that intelligence gathered from international partners had supported Thomas's prosecution, even if that intelligence was no longer usable in court. The lasting legacy to the story of Joseph Thomas, Jihad Jack, remains one of the most contentious legal episodes in Australian history. It revealed deep tensions between protecting a nation from emerging threats and preserving the rights of its citizens. Though he rarely speaks publicly now, Thomas's life became a powerful symbol of what happens when fear, law, and public perception collide. For some, he will always be a man who made reckless and dangerous choices for others. He is a cautionary tale, a man tried in the court of public opinion, punished without proof, and marked forever by suspicion. The case of Joseph Thomas is no longer just a legal saga. It is a stark reminder of how, in the fight against terror, even a free man can remain a prisoner of his past. Story 9, in transition to Story 10. After his release, Joseph Thomas largely withdrew from the public eye, choosing to avoid media attention whenever possible. In the few interviews he gave, he expressed deep regret for traveling to Afghanistan, but maintained that he had never intended to harm anyone. He insisted his time in Pakistan was rooted in religious study, not terrorism, and that he had become ensnared in events far beyond his control. Yet for many Australians, his story stood as a cautionary tale in the post-9/11's world. Even the perception of a connection to terrorism could unravel a person's entire life. Despite his legal victory and the eventual dismissal of his convictions, Thomas remained a man under suspicion. His movements were monitored, his name forever linked to terrorism, and his future uncertain. Though his control orders were periodically reviewed, authorities continued to justify them on national security grounds. Any hope of returning to a normal life faded with time. The stigma attached to the label Jihad Jack lingered, whether earned or not. It was a burden he could never fully shake as Australia's counter-terrorism framework evolved, shaped by new laws and rising global threats. The case of Joseph Thomas became a landmark. It illuminated the delicate balance between national security and civil liberties, and the devastating human cost of getting that balance wrong. By the time the restrictions on his life were finally lifted, the damage was irreversible. His life had been defined by a single chapter, one marked by suspicion, legal controversy, and enduring public scorning. The end, whether he posed a genuine threat, ceased to matter. To the public, he would always be Jihad Jack, a symbol of the murky, fear-driven era of global counter-terrorism. Story 10. The assassination of Munir Said Thalib, 2004-2006. In 2006, Indonesia found itself at the center of a chilling political scandal that reverberated across the globe. The case involved the assassination of one of the country's most courageous human rights defenders, Munir Said Thalib, a lawyer and activist renowned for his relentless advocacy against military abuses and enforced disappearance. Manor, a founding member of the Commission for the Disappeared and Victims of Violence, Contras, had long been a thorn in the side of Indonesia's powerful military and intelligence apparatus. His death under highly suspicious circumstances, would expose not only the vulnerability of human rights defenders, but also the deep-rooted problems within Indonesia's justice and intelligence systems. On September 7, 2004, Munir boarded Garuda Indonesia flight G974 from Jakarta to Amsterdam, with a layover in Singapore, but during the long-haul flight, he began experiencing severe nausea, intense abdominal pain, and vomiting. A doctor on board attempted to treat him, but his condition worsened rapidly. Munir was pronounced dead before the plane landed in Amsterdam. An autopsy conducted by Dutch authorities soon confirmed the worst fears. Munir had been poisoned, the cause of death. A lethal dose of arsenic. The revelation stunned the nation and provoked outrage from international human rights organizations. This was not a natural death, it was a calculated assassination. As public pressure mounted, attention turned to Polikarpus Budi Hari Prianto, a Garuda Indonesia pilot who, though officially off-duty, had managed to secure a seat on the same flight. Specifically, a non-flying assignment. Evidence revealed that Polikarpus had offered his business class seat to Munir shortly after boarding, placing the activist in a vulnerable position. Investigators also uncovered suspicious communications between Polikarpus and members of Indonesia's state intelligence agency, BEN. In the days leading up to the murdering December 2005, Polikarpus was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to 14 years in prison, a sentence later upheld in April 2006. But in a stunning reversal, the Supreme Court of Indonesia annulled his conviction later that year, citing a lack of evidence. Public outcry followed. The Attorney General's office sought a judicial review, and in January 2008, the Supreme Court reinstated Polikarpus's conviction, increasing his sentence to 20 years. The legal back and forth fueled widespread criticism. Human rights organizations viewed the initial acquittal as emblematic of Indonesia's struggle to hold powerful institutions accountable, especially when state actors may be implicated throughout the investigation. Activists voiced persistent concerns that the murder was far more than a lone act. Many believed that Munir's assassination was a coordinated effort, designed to eliminate a prominent critic of the military and silence dissent. Despite the mounting suspicions, no high-ranking officials were ever convicted. The question of who ordered Munir's murder remains unresolved to this day. The assassination sent shockwaves through Indonesian civil society. It starkly illustrated the dangers faced by those who speak out against corruption and abuse. But Munir's death also became a rallying point. His legacy inspired a new generation of activists, and organizations formed in his honor continued his work fighting for justice, truth, and accountability. Though the case formally concluded with Polikarpus's conviction, the broader battle for justice remains ongoing. Munir's murder is now seen as a defining moment in Indonesia's democratic evolution, a reminder of both the risks of activism and the urgent need for institutional reform. His name is etched into the country's memory, not only as a victim, but as a symbol of courage, resistance, and the enduring struggle for human rights. The assassination of Munir, said Talib, a quest for justice in the shadows of power. The murder of Munir, said Thalib, was no random act. It was an intentional, premeditated assassination. The question that haunted Indonesia and the world was not just who executed the crime, but who ordered it, and why. As Indonesia's legal system began unraveling the layers of this complex and deeply political case, suspicion quickly turned toward powerful forces. Munir, a prominent human rights activist and founder of Contras, the Commission for Disappeared and Victims of Violence, had made enemies in high places. His tireless investigations had exposed rampant military abuses and corruption. Many believed he had become a threat to the very institutions he had spent years holding accountable. Attention soon focused on one man, Polikarpus Budi Hari Prianto, a pilot with Garuda Indonesia. The evidence against him was compelling, but discovered that in the days leading up to Munir's departure for the Netherlands, Polikarpus had made numerous phone calls to individuals linked to Indonesia's state intelligence agency BIN. These calls were made from his personal phone and connected him directly to senior intelligence officials, while the exact content of those conversations remained unknown. Their timing and frequency raised serious suspicions. Had Polycarpus acted alone, or was he part of a broader, state-sponsored conspiracy? The prosecution argued that Polycarpus played a central role in facilitating Munia's poisoning. Forensic analysis revealed that Munia had ingested a lethal dose of arsenic likely administered during the flight. One particularly troubling detail stood out. Although he wasn't on duty, Polycarpus had boarded the same flight and generously offered his business class seat to Munir shortly after takeoff. It was a gesture that, on the surface, appeared kind, but investigators saw it differently. They believed it was a calculated move, designed to isolate Munier from other passengers and crew, making it easier to carry out the poisoning undetected. Investigators discovered that, in the days leading up to Munir's departure for the Netherlands, Polycarpus had made numerous phone calls to individuals linked to Indonesia's state intelligence agency BIN. These calls were made from his personal phone and connected him directly to senior intelligence officials, while the exact content of those conversations remained unknown. Their timing and frequency raised serious suspicions. Had Polycarpus acted alone, or was he part of a broader, state-sponsored conspiracy? The prosecution argued that Polycarpus played a central role in facilitating Munia's poisoning. Forensic analysis revealed that Munia had ingested a lethal dose of arsenic likely administered during the flight. One particularly troubling detail stood out. Although he wasn't on duty, Polycarpus had boarded the same flight and generously offered his business class seat to Munir. Shortly after takeoff, it was a gesture that, on the surface, appeared kind, but investigators saw it differently. They believed it was a calculated move, designed to isolate Munir from other passengers and crew, making it easier to carry out the poisoning undetected. Even more suspicious was the document Polycarpus used to justify his presence on the flight. A forged assignment letter from Garuda, Indonesia's security division. This wasn't a random trip. He had been placed there for a reason, however. Proving that Polycarpus personally administered the poison was a greater challenge no witness could definitively link him to Munia's meals or drinks. By mid-2006, the case had become one of Indonesia's most high-profile legal battles. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and human rights observers watched every development closely. Public interest was at a fever pitch. Many feared that powerful political interests were working behind the scenes to derail Justice Emunar's widow. Susiwati refused to back down. She remained at the forefront of the campaign for accountability, refusing to accept the narrative that her husband's murder was the work of a lone actor alongside human rights groups. She demanded a deeper investigation into the role of Beyond. Despite this mounting pressure, the legal proceedings were riddled with delays and contradictions. The defense team for Polycarpus pushed back aggressively, arguing that there was no direct evidence linking their client to the poisoning. They pointed out that the same meals were served to other passengers and crew. Yet only Munir fell ill, raising the possibility that he may have been poisoned before even boarding the aircraft. Nevertheless, in August 2006, the court delivered its verdict. Polycarpus was found guilty of conspiracy to commit premeditated murder and sentenced to 14 years in prison. It was seen as a step toward justice, but only a small one. Critics called the conviction a partial victory. They said, was not the mastermind only a pawn in a much larger operation? The real architects of the murder remained in the shadows, untouched by the law, though it was rare for anyone with ties to Indonesia's intelligence agency to face punishment. The ruling still left much to be desired. The verdict also laid bare a sobering reality. In cases involving powerful interests, justice in Indonesia could still be elusive. Then, in a stunning twist, the Supreme Court annulled Polycarpus's conviction in October 2006. The decision shocked the public. The court cited insufficient direct evidence proving that he had administered the arsenic while his presence on the flight, his phone records, and his forged travel documents all raised red flags. The court ruled that they did not conclusively establish guilt to many. The decision was a devastating setback, it appeared, to confirm the public's worst fear, that even in a case as high-profile as this, accountability could be outmaneuvered by power and influence. The reaction was swift. Susiwati, supported by national and international human rights groups, launched a fierce campaign to overturn the ruling. They accused the judiciary of caving under political pressure and called for a full judicial review. Media outlets across Indonesia published investigative reports and editorials, keeping the spotlight on the case. Civil society organizations demanded the formation of an independent commission to investigate Bin's role, but resistance came from every corner of the establishment. Then, new evidence emerged in late 2006. Leaked intelligence documents hinted at a far more complex conspiracy. According to one former beneficial speaking anonymously, Munir had been labeled a national security threat by top intelligence commanders. His vocal criticism of military and government abuses, they claimed, had made him a target for elimination, but without a willing whistleblower or irrefutable documentation. These claims remained speculative. International pressure continued to grow. The Netherlands, where Munir had been headed for postgraduate studies, demanded that Indonesia hold those responsible fully accountable. Organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the sluggish pace of justice and called for transparency. By this point, Munir's case had transcended the murder of one man. It had become a symbol of the fight against impunity, a litmus test for Indonesia's commitment to human rights and democratic reform. The case exposed deep flaws in Indonesia's law enforcement and judiciary, especially when state institutions were under scrutiny. While Polikarpus was eventually reconvicted and sent back to prison in 2008, no high-ranking intelligence official was ever tried or convicted. For many, justice for Munir remains incomplete. His death continues to cast a long shadow over Indonesia's democracy, a stark reminder that the price of truth can be fatal, and that in the pursuit of justice, the fight is often far from over. Story 10. The murder of Munir, said Thalaby, the end of 2006. The fight for justice and the murder of Munir, said Thalab, had become emblematic of Indonesia's broader struggle for human rights and accountability as public pressure mounted. The Indonesian Attorney General's office responded by filing for a judicial review of Polikarpus Budi Hadi Prianto as controversial acquittal. The move was widely seen as a concession to growing national outrage, but it also rekindled hope. There was now a renewed possibility that justice could still prevail. The prosecution pushed for Polikarpus's conviction to be reinstated, presenting new evidence suggesting deeper ties to agents within Indonesia's state intelligence agency. Then a court date was set for early 2007, with the nation waiting to see whether Indonesia's legal system would finally hold all those responsible to account. By this point, the country was sharply divided. Some viewed Polikarpus's original conviction as a victory for justice. Others saw his brief release as proof that power could still bend the justice system to its will. The most pressing question, who within the state had authorized Munir's assassination, remained ominously unanswered. The pursuit of justice had clearly grown beyond just one man. It was about confronting a deeply rooted culture of impunity, long shielded within Indonesia's military and political circles. Munir's death had transcended the realm of a criminal case. It had become a litmus test for Indonesia's democratic maturity, defining moment in the nation's evolution. Outcome of the case would set the tone for how Indonesia handled future instances of political violence. If those behind Munir's murder walked free, despite overwhelming evidence, it would send a chilling message that to speak out against power in Indonesia was to risk death. As 2006 drew to a close, Munir's widow, Susiwati, and his supporters vowed to continue the fight. Protests, rallies, and campaigns surged in the streets and across media platforms, ensuring that Munir's name would not be forgotten and that the call for justice would not fade into silence. The question of whether justice would ever be served remained unanswered, but one thing was clear, Munir said. Thalib's legacy as a fearless defender of human rights would endure. His death became not just a tragedy, but a symbol of the high price of truth and the unrelenting need to protect it. Story 11. The murder of Alberto Adriano. In the year 2000, Germany was confronted with a horrific act of racist violence that exposed the undercurrents of xenophobia still festering within its society. The victim was Alberto Adriano, a 39-year-old Mozambican man who had called Germany home for over a decade. Alberto arrived in East Germany in 1988 as a contract worker, eventually settling in December, where he worked at a meat processing plant. He built a quiet life with his partner and their 3 children. Friends and neighbors described him as hardworking and devoted to his family. On the evening of June 10, 2000, Alberto watched the Euro 2000 football championships opening match with friends. Later, he began the short walk home just 400 meters away, cutting through the familiar paths of DeSalle City Park. But unknown to him, 3 young men, Enrico H., Frank M., and Christian A., were also there that night. They were intoxicated, angry, and fueled by neo-Nazi ideology. The men, aged 16 to 24, had missed their train and wandered the park, shouting, "Heil, Hitler!" Their voices tearing through the night air. When they saw Alberto, they didn't hesitate. Motivated solely by the color of his skin, they attacked him without provocation. The beating was merciless. Alberto was punched, kicked, and stomped on repeatedly, especially in the head, until he was left unconscious. Passersby eventually discovered his brutalized body and called for help. Alberto was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were catastrophic. After 3 days in a coma, he died on June 13. His murder sent shockwaves throughout Germany. The sheer cruelty of the attack, its racist underpinnings, and the public nature of the violence forced the country to confront the uncomfortable reality of rising far-right extremism. The perpetrators were quickly arrested in court. It became clear they had deep ties to neo-Nazi groups and had previously participated in racist acts. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Enrico H., identified as the ringleader, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Frank M. and Christian A., both minors, received 9-year sentences. In juvenile detention, Alberto's funeral was attended by then-Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, a rare and powerful gesture that underscored the gravity of the crime. He declared the sentence appropriate for such a heinous act, signaling a national reckoning with the re-emergence of extremist hate. But Alberto's murder was not an isolated incident. Between 2000 and 2007, Germany witnessed a wave of racially motivated killings linked to a shadowy neo-Nazi terror group known as the National Socialist Underground, or NSU. Their campaign of targeted violence against immigrants, mostly of Turkish origin, left at least 10 people dead for years. The NSU operated undetected, a grim indictment of institutional bias and failures in Germany's law enforcement and intelligence systems. The death of Alberto Adriano and the revelations about the NSU forced Germany to look inward. Public outrage sparked a wave of reforms, memorials, and initiatives. Schools adopted anti-xenophobia education. Government agencies began dismantling extremist networks. Memorials were erected in remembrance of the victims. Yet, the damage ran deep. The events of 2000 and the years that followed laid bare the fragility of social unity and the persistent threat posed by radical ideologies. Alberto Adriano became a symbol, a stark reminder of the real and lethal consequences of unchecked hatred. Though Germany has made significant strides in combating far-right extremism, the battle is far from over. New political movements and periodic outbreaks of racial violence continue to test the nation's resolve. Alberto's story, tragic and powerful, serves as an enduring warning that the cost of complacency in the face of hatred can be measured in human lives, and that justice, though late, must be loud enough to echo across generations. The human cost of hatred. The murder of Alberto Adriano, and Germany's reckoning. The murder of Alberto Adriano, in June 2000, was more than just a crime. It was a seismic event that exposed the deep, unsettling truth that racism and extremism were still very much alive in modern Germany. A black man beaten to death in a public park by 3 young men, solely because of his race, forced the country to confront the uncomfortable reality that hatred had not died with the past. It had merely gone underground. Doberto, a Mozambican immigrant who had come to Germany seeking opportunity and a better life for his family, instead found unimaginable violence in Dessau, a city grappling with economic instability after German reunification. The conditions were ripe for radical ideologies to take root. Unemployment, social disenfranchisement, and lingering resentment had created a fertile ground for far-right extremism. While much of the community was horrified by the attack and held candlelight vigils in Alberto's memory, there were those who quietly sympathized with the killers in the days after the murder. Far-right graffiti appeared across the city, chilling reminders that some did not see Alberto's death as a tragedy, but as an act of defiance for Alberto's family. The loss was unfathomable. His wife was left to explain the unexplainable to their young children, why their father would never return home. Too young to fully comprehend the gravity of what had happened, the children nonetheless absorbed the sorrow that hung heavily over their household. Media coverage reduced Alberto's life to headlines about hate and violence. But for his family, he was a husband, a father, a man with hopes and dreams, and now he was gone. As the trial of the 3 perpetrators began, the German legal system came under intense scrutiny. Many feared leniency. After all, far-right crimes in the past had often been minimized, but this time, the world was watching. The brutality of the attack and the unmistakable racial motive drew international condemnation. Human rights organizations and foreign leaders demanded justice in court. The horror deepened. Witnesses recalled hearing racial slurs as the men kicked and stomped Alberto. Forensic experts described injuries so severe they shattered bones and caused irreversible brain damage. This was not a drunken fight. This was an act of sadistic violence. The defense claimed intoxication and youthful recklessness. But the facts told a different story. The men had clear ties to neo-Nazi groups. They had attended far-right rallies, voiced racist beliefs, and harassed immigrants long before the attack. This was the culmination of years of hate. As the proceedings continued, it became evident that this trial was not just about 3 men. It was about Germany itself. How could a generation born after World War II still harbor such venomous racism? How had hatred survived decades of education and remembrance? Chancellor Gerhard Schrader's attendance at Alberto's funeral was a symbolic gesture. He urged stronger action against hate groups and called for national introspection. But for many activists and minority communities, words were not enough. They demanded real change, greater protections for immigrants, harsher penalties for hate crimes, and the dismantling of extremist networks. When the verdict was finally delivered, Enrico H., the main assailant, received a life sentence. His 2 younger accomplices were sentenced to 9 years in juvenile detention. The ruling brought mixed feelings: relief that justice had been served, but skepticism that it would deter future crimes. After all, the roots of the problem ran deeper than any single courtroom decision. In the aftermath, Germany found itself at a crossroads. Schools introduced anti-racism programs. Law enforcement vowed to pursue extremists more aggressively. Communities organized outreach efforts in Dessau. Candlelight vigils became an annual tradition, honoring Alberto's memory and recommitting to the fight against hate. And yet, racism did not disappear, for right groups adapted to the digital age. Spreading ideology through online platforms, hate crimes persisted. Nationalist political parties gained traction, exploiting economic uncertainty and fears of cultural erosion. Despite reforms and awareness, extremism evolved and endured. For Alberto's family, the pain never lessened. His wife struggled to raise their children alone, haunted by the knowledge of how brutally he had been taken. The children, once shielded from the full story, grew up with the weight of their father's murder and what it represented: a man killed simply for being different. For many in the Mozambican and broader immigrant communities in Germany. Alberto's murder was a stark reminder. Despite their contributions to society, they remained vulnerable. Some considered leaving, others chose to stay and fight for their right to belong over time. The two younger men, imprisoned for Alberto's murder, became the subject of debate. Could they be rehabilitated? Had they truly grasped the enormity of what they had done, or had prison only hardened their beliefs? In 2001, a year after the murder, a memorial was erected in Desso's city park, the very place where Alberto was killed. The inscription read, "In memory of Alberto Adriano, murdered because of racism, never again." It was a powerful tribute and a warning. Each year, people gathered there to lay flowers and speak out against hate, but as the years passed, the urgency began to fade. The outrage softened, new headlines replaced old ones, the cycle repeated. Another hate crime, another promise, another moment of reckoning. Still, for those who lived with racism, the fight continued. Activists pushed for reformed victims, spoke out, communities stood in solidarity, and in Desso, in the stillness of the park, Alberto's memorial remained a solemn reminder of what had been lost and what must be preserved. Alberto Adriano's story is a painful lesson, a lesson that hatred festers in silence, that justice isn't only about punishing the guilty, about preventing the next tragedy, that remembrance without action is not enough. What happened to Alberto can never be undone, but his memory can drive a nation forward. It can serve as a call to never look away, to confront hatred wherever it hides, and to ensure that no one else suffers the same fate simply for being different.